Okay, I want to mention a few things about the brainstem, and instead of struggling with that model this time, I removed the brainstem ahead of time. This actually is showing you, not just the brainstem, right? Because there's also the thalamus that sits on top of the brainstem, and there's also the parts of the insular lobe, right, which is important for mapping the internal state of the body, all those visceral afferents from the gut, from the enteric nervous system, from your stomach and your small intestine and your large intestine, basically like, how do you feel? Like what's going on viscerally are going to be mapped, in this insular lobe, this sort of hidden lobe deep inside the brain that's going to play a pretty significant role, obviously, in drug use disorders, right? And it plays a big role in social decision making, as well, because you feel things, you feel consequences. When you imagine what might happen, you have an internal navigation system because of all the mistakes that we've all made in our lives that have provided rather visceral feedback. So this is looking at the front of the brainstem. This is called the ventral surface of the brainstem, and you can note that first of all, there's this really dramatic artery here. It's called the basilar artery that is actually formed from these two, what are called this vertebral arteries, which run down the vertebrae of your spinal cord and help to feed the spinal cord. But this lower portion here is called the medulla. This portion here with a great deal of white matter sort of wrapped around it is called the pons. And then this portion up here is known as the midbrain. And the midbrain is pretty critical for what we're going to be describing. Actually, the brainstem as a whole is, because there are many nuclei, throughout the brainstem. These are clumps of subcortical gray matter, right? Individual nuclei, sets of neurons, cell bodies, and the synaptic connections that are going to send their white matter, their axons, out of the brainstem to form synaptic connections with structures in different parts of the brain. So this is nuclei that release what we call the classical neurotransmitters, which we're going to be talking about in some detail. Classical really just means they were discovered first. So this includes, though, a lot of very important what we call modulatory classical neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters you've likely heard of, like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, norepinephrine. So the nuclei that the cell bodies where the genes are expressed for the enzymes to synthesize dopamine or norepinephrine, et cetera, those nuclei are going to be clustered in clumps in the brainstem, and then they're going to send their projections out to release dopamine, for example, in other structures, or norepinephrine, in other places around the brain. So we'll talk about those as we talk about individual neurotransmitters. So the brainstem is really important. And actually those modulatory transmitters, like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, those classical neurotransmitters that play such a big role, we're going to see in the actions of drugs. They actually serve sort of a modulatory role in terms of their location here in the cerebellum. Like when you are engaged and active and, involved in your environment, you're alert and, awake, etc., you're going to actually have relatively high levels of activity, in all of these specialized nuclei that are releasing dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, like around the brain. And then when you start to get drowsy, when you start to get tired, well, their firing rate will slow. Actually, their organization is rather fascinating and beautiful. They have, these nuclei, these clumps of gray matter, clumps of cell bodies with the dendrites and the synaptic connections localized in different portions of the brainstem. But then their axons, the white matter that extends out into the rest of the brain, it reticulates. It's fan-like. It has these fan-like projections. There is sort of a big cable that runs down the middle that we'll talk about as we move on, called the medial forebrain bundle of axons. But it sort of forms this reticular distribution, particularly with norepinephrine, we'll see. And so this whole collection of nuclei in the brainstem, that are coded for by, the specific neurotransmitter that they release, that sort of reticulate around. This is sometimes referred to as the reticular formation, or the reticular activating system. of your brain. So you can think of the brainstem as important. It's like a power source, for the rest of the brain. It can turn on and modulate the level of arousal of the rest of the brain. This is, the brainstem is an evolutionarily very ancient part of the brain. There are many nuclei in the brainstem that are sort of essential for survival, like autonomic nuclei that can help control, for example, the rate of breathing or heart rate and things like that. So the brainstem is a really critical part of sort of monitoring aspects of the internal milieu and sort of keeping you alive. There are also, you should think of the brainstem as being, where a great many ascending afferent fibers, like the white matter, the axons of neurons, that are transmitting, sensory information about the body, right, are working their way up through. It's a lot of cabling, a lot of white matter going through the brainstem, and also a lot of motor output, like motor commands, like efferent output is going to be working its way sort of down, through the brainstem and into the spinal cord to move. There's also like all sorts of, fascinating sort of nuclei here that control, for example, basic sort of emotional expressions, like facial expressions, or postural adjustments, etc., are localized also